So now that we're in Illustrator, I'm going to carry through with my octahedron design here, start to finish. That way it's sort of cohesive as I work through. You're welcome to choose whichever shape you want. But we're going to sort of design this project in reverse. I'm going to take off the wooden frames for right now and just think of our sort of blank model here. And actually I'm going to take one step back from that blank model and bring in the sort of printed template, right, that I had to cut out in order to get there. And you know what, while we're at it, let's just kind of keep designing backwards in time here and go all the way back to our flat, untrimmed printed piece of paper. You're gonna find that with access to Illustrator but no printer, this won't really do you a whole lot of good. So you're gonna have to have some sort of access to a printer too, so that we can use these scaled printouts as sort of the architecture of our design. But in the most basic sense, I want to be able to get into Illustrator and render out life-size maps, life-size sort of blueprints for our design. And so in Illustrator, we're looking at being able to draw out forms like this. This is what an octahedron looks like if you cut it apart and lay it flat on a piece of paper. Each one of these black lines is a fold. Each one of these sort of tabs that's bumped out is a glue tab that would eventually be folded under and glued into the design. Now, all of those pieces are things that we're going to have to render out manually in Illustrator. One of the great things about Illustrator is that it gives you that amount of control to do each and every one of those things. So let's go to a brand new document and begin this from scratch. If you don't already have an 8.5 by 11 inch blank document created from yesterday, let's just open up a brand new one. I'm going to tap F to go full screen on my computer. That toggles view spaces. Those keyboard shortcuts can be really handy, especially if you are working on a smaller laptop. What I want to be able to do is tap it up to full screen but not lose my toolbar on the left, my options and control bars on the top, and my palettes on the right. I'm going to go Command minus a few clicks and move over to some blank white space over here. Because what we're going to have to do is talk a little bit about drawing in Illustrator. Now, we're comfortable with the idea, I think, of being able to draw something like this in our sketchbook, right? And maybe this is a little bit hyper simplistic, but we would call this maybe the outline, and probably wouldn't even refer to what's going on inside there. But when we do something similar in Illustrator, I'll click over here on my shape builder tool, the rectangle, and grab a polygon. Now, a single click with the mouse will pop open my polygon selector here. I'm going to draw a three-sided polygon and just sort of render this thing out. There we go. So that is the very beginning of my octahedron here. I probably wouldn't even describe what's going on inside of there, but I would want to call that my outline. Now in Illustrator, this has a very particular label here. We're going to call that the stroke. And what's going on inside of our stroke is called the fill. Now, in the most basic sense, we can control things about that stroke and that fill. So if I come up here to my equilateral triangle that I just rendered, and I bump up to my options bar up here, my control bar on top, I have access to my stroke size. The stroke size here is labeled in points. If I jump up to a 30-point stroke, I have a really nice thick sort of fatter outline, and I can bump that same shape down to a much thinner outline, so the weight of the stroke can be modified. Now, if I can modify the weight of the stroke, I should be able to do some work with the inside here, or what we'll call the fill. And to do that kind of work, I'll come down to these two fill and stroke sort of option selectors in the bottom of my toolbar. As long as I'm selected on my equilateral triangle, I can do things like modify the fill color of my stroke by double-clicking the fill option. I'll use sort of a gray fill on the inside of my triangle here. That way I can see what I'm doing. And I could change the color of my stroke, but I think I'll leave that stroke alone and just render that thing in a little bit larger stroke so it's a bit easier to see. So black stroke, kind of a soft gray fill. Now the other thing that I can manipulate about the sort of color options here is something called opacity. Now this is a little bit tricky to see if I just have one triangle off to the side, but if I duck the opacity, you'll see it kind of looks a little bit like it's getting lighter. Now what it's not actually getting lighter so much as it's becoming more transparent. So if I layer 2 or 3 of these triangles on top of each other, you'll see that I can actually start to see through them. by ducking the opacity. Now, opacities are additive. You see that when I have 3 triangles stacked on top of each other, if each one of those triangles is a 30% opacity, I'm getting about a 90% version of this gray that I originally had over here. So stroke weight, stroke color, fill color, and opacity are all things we can use to our advantage as designers. Now let's talk a little bit more about how I actually got my equilateral triangle to begin with and what makes this such a powerful approach for designing it all. I'm going to click and hold on my shape builder tool again and just kind of scroll through some of the presets in here. Rectangle tool, that's going to be a really handy one in case I'm designing something like the cube. Keyboard shortcut M will also get you that tool. Now, it defaults to drawing sort of rectangular shapes. If you would like that to be perfect square, hold Shift as you're rendering out that square, and it will render perfect square each time. Now, another really common shape that is used by designers would be the ellipse tool. The ellipse tool is another way of saying the circle tool. That'll render out ovals, or if you are interested, hold Shift and that'll render out a perfect circle. Now the tool that I'm using to render out my octahedron is going to be the polygon tool. And if I click once with the mouse, I get to choose how many sides my polygon has. I did before, a 3-sided polygon will give me a perfect equilateral triangle. Just for the sake of demonstration, say I wanted a 5-sided polygon, just kind of make that one click. 20-sided polygon starts to look a whole lot like a circle, but you kind of get the idea, right? Now, if I want to start to manipulate these shapes once I've built them, this is really where we get into the meat of why Illustrator is such an exciting program for a designer. Using my main selection tool, I'm not really able to necessarily see why this is such an exciting program, so I have to switch my selection tool from my selection tool, keyboard shortcut V, to my direct selection tool, keyboard shortcut A. I want you to remember those 2 keyboard shortcuts and maybe even get in the habit of working with 2 hands, one hand on the mouse and one hand on A and V. Now with V selected, my entire shape will be moved around. Now let's just say, for example, I don't have a fill on my shape, or I set the fill to none. It really matters where I click, right? I can't click on the inside of my shape because there's nothing to move around. So if I want to move this shape, I have to click on the path or click on this stroke on the outside. But if I have a stroke on the outside, or if I have a fill on the inside, now there is something in there. I can click on the inside and the whole shape moves with me. If I use keyboard shortcut A, each one of the corners of my shape here has a little blue node, or what Illustrator calls an anchor point. Now these anchor points don't describe a rastered or pixel-based version of this shape, but they describe sort of a free-forming mathematical equation, a vector equation, that allows me to manipulate anchor points either individually or by modifying them one at a time. And with the direct select tool, I'm able to modify and pull each one of those anchor points around. Now if I use V again, I can move that whole shape. If I use A, I have complete control over each one of those individual anchor points. And it doesn't matter what kind of shape you draw in Illustrator, whether you're working with circles or whether you're working with squares, every shape is built out of these little nodes. So a square has an anchor point at each corner that I can modify and pull around. Circles are also made up of these anchor points, and so I can start to modify these. What you'll see in these circles is that they also have what are called handles that pull out, and these handles can be modified by pulling on the handle instead, and this modifies the curve. So with that equilateral triangle, there are a couple of kind of interesting ways that we can manipulate it. As long as I'm on the selection tools here, I might as well talk about rotational movements. Move tool allows me to kind of transform this thing in all these different shapes. If I hover over the corner of the bounding box, my move arrow changes from just sort of being a standard black arrow to being this little corner arrow, and I can introduce a rotation to this equilateral triangle. Now that assumes that I want my triangle to pivot around its center point, and that may be precisely where you want it to pivot. But let's just say, for example, I was trying to carefully align 2 of these triangles, and I wanted them to, line up right at the edge. It could be sort of a pain to sort of try to, rotate and trial and error it in there. It would be a lot nicer if I could get a rotation to pivot right at the corner. Well, the rotation tool, keyboard shortcut R, or it's this tool hiding over here in the toolbar, allows me to select and move the rotational point. So the first click with the rotate tool sort of chooses the pivot point. Keyboard shortcut R is the fastest way I find to work with this. R chooses the rotational pivot point, and then the second click is your rotation. So I'll just kind of pivot my triangle into position here. Use keyboard shortcut V to move it, keyboard shortcut R to set that pivot point, and now I can kind of bring these two triangles into alignment much easier because I was able to pivot at that corner instead of automatically at the center. Now that doesn't mean that you might not, want to use both of them. I just find that it's really handy as a designer to have a few of these basic transform tools. Now I've already done something once or twice that might be a bit confusing. That would be to make quick copies of an object. So if I start with my polygon tool, if I had to go and redraw this thing each time, that could be a real pain. Wouldn't it be nice if I could just make a quick copy instead of having to redraw it? Now there are a couple ways that I could do this. The sort of classic computer Command C, Command V works. Command V all day long, and if you just kind of keep stacking them, they just sort of keep piling up there. Just be careful, because two triangles perfectly stacked on top of each other just look like one triangle. The other thing, and you'll see me use this a lot in my tutorials, is that I hold the Option key or the Alt key, and I pull it to the side. Now you'll see that my little my selection arrows are now doubled. I have a black and white arrow. That can be a really handy tool for making quick copies. You'll notice too that because I have my smart guides activated, that there's a purple line that sort of pulls out that tells me when I'm in alignment or when I'm right at the edge of the design. These are really helpful align tools especially for what we're about to do, to try to get our shapes to be in perfect alignment so that our folds all line up in a really, really nice way. But if I don't want to pay attention to those purple lines, I can also hold Shift as I pull it sideways, and that will lock my transformation or lock my copy into a horizontal, or for that matter, a vertical orientation, so that my shapes stay in perfect alignment. Now, if the shapes that you need to draw are either not available to you in these basic kind of tools here, keyboard shortcut M, right? I mean, the square is pretty basic. I could always either start with a square and then modify it, or I could use a tool called the pen tool and create my own individual anchor points. Let's start by just modifying the anchor points on our square first, because I think that's a little bit easier to work through, easier to understand than the pen tool right away. So once I draw a square, if I want to modify each one of these anchor points, I could use keyboard shortcut A to move them. As long as I'm selected on one at a time, I can easily move them. I can add and delete them as well. So I'm going to introduce the pen tool, which is toward the top of the toolbar. If you click and hold on it, you'll see that it has a couple of different personalities. Keyboard shortcut P is the one that I use most often, so I'll stick with that. And if I hover over existing anchor points in my modified square here, you can see that the pen tool changes from having a little star next to it to, if I hover over an existing anchor point, gives me a little negative sign, or if I hover over a path, which is that stroke that connects two anchor points, it gives me a little plus sign. So if I hover over that path, and I can drop an anchor point in the middle of each one of those paths, keyboard shortcut A then allows me to sort of bend and pull in those shapes from right where those anchor points are. Keyboard shortcut P again brings me back to the pen tool, and now I hover over those same anchor points, and it gives me the option to delete anchor points. So it kind of brings me back to that space, or modify a shape on the fly. So if you can kind of navigate back and forth between the pen tool and the direct select tool, there's a lot of quick work you can do to sort of modify and build shapes while you're working in Illustrator. If I didn't really want to start with a square, if I just wanted to start dropping anchor points freehand, we can start to work with the pen tool right away. Now, I know in the back of your head, you're thinking pen tool, well, kind of like Sharpie pen, you touch it on the page and you just start to draw your lines. That is not how the pen tool works. The pen tool is actually a little bit more like dropping individual anchor points. And as I drop those anchor points, a path is automatically generated that connects them. Now, if you start to think about the pen tool as really only generating these anchor points, it's a much easier tool to understand because I'm only modifying the points. I'm not really modifying the paths yet. To do that, grab the pen tool, keyboard shortcut P, and click once in your design, and now this line that automatically kind of emanates from that path isn't really drawing anything yet. I'm going to click again, and that drops another corner on my polygon, and each click starts to drop another edge to that polygon. If I come back all the way to my first anchor point, you notice that my pen tool gets a little small circle next to it. Think of that circle as like a complete sign, right? Like I want my shape to be completed. So right next to that design, click that circle or join the final edges together. Now I have a completed or a joined shape. If as I'm drawing shapes in Illustrator, I think to myself, oh, that looks pretty good, I'm done, but I don't actually finish that bottom edge, that could potentially cause some problems later on. For us, since I want to be able to think of each one of my lines as a fold, if I took off my fill, you'd notice that I'm actually missing that bottom path. If I come in with the pen tool and hover over an open path, I get a little slash. That slash is asking me, do I want to pick up where I left off? And then I come back to that first anchor point and drop it, and that completes that shape so that now it's a completed fillable shape. Now the last thing I want to talk about before we actually get down to building our design would be making use of the align palette. So I'll generate my three-sided polygon again, my equilateral triangle, and I'm also going to make sure that my align palette is open over here on the right hand side. If yours isn't open, go to Window, Align, or use the keyboard shortcut Shift F7. Now I kind of liked having sort of a light gray fill turned on here so that I can differentiate between my background. The stroke here is probably okay. I'll just bump it up just a little bit to make it even more easily visible. But essentially, I need to work with the ability to make carefully aligned triangles. If each one of these triangles, I was trying to kind of design them and arrange them, I could sort of like rotate them into position, and each one of them could kind of work. But I want to be able to take advantage of some things in the computer, right, that can help speed me along. The first thing would be the align palette. If I wanted each one of these triangles to snap to a line right along the bottom, an imaginary line along the bottom, I'll click and drag over all four of them using my selection tool, keyboard shortcut V, and I'll come to my align palette and I'll hover over the image that sort of matches my idea for how I want them to align. Vertical align bottom, I want them to snap to an imaginary line down on the bottom somewhere. Click that once and they all snap to that line. If I want them all to sort of have an even distribution, I can either horizontally align them center or vertically align them center. So I'm going to snap them all to themselves. Nope, that's not what I want. I want to distribute them. So I'm going to horizontally distribute them so that now they have all an equal amount of space in between them. You notice though that, see how each one of these corners is slightly overlapping? That tells me that I'm not quite lined up edge to edge to edge. So I could, just kind of like bump these out and, wait until they're all in perfect alignment. But there's probably an even faster way for me to generate that kind of perfect arrangement, and that might be using guides or grids. So I'll just kind of introduce you to both here in case you like the idea. Keyboard shortcut Command R. That would be Control R for you PC guys. That gives you a ruler on the top and left-hand side of your workspace. Now I'm going to click in the vertical ruler and pull down a guide, and you'll notice that when I pull down this guide, it sort of makes this neon blue or neon green line. Now that's not a piece of my design. That's only a guide that falls into as sort of like an alignment assist. Right, now this would be really handy for just sort of aligning shapes along an XY axis. If you would like something that's a little bit more universal or more expansive, right? Go to View, and you can activate your grid by clicking Show Grid. Now you could design your entire template, your entire blueprint based on this graph here, to sort of not only help you scale everything correctly, but to also just keep you in perfect alignment. And now we'll get down to actually building the basic template for our octahedron. I'm essentially going to try to end up with one piece of 8.5 by 11 inch paper with two prints on the outside. One of them that may include some texture or color, and one of them that's just plain white. So how do you jump from the ability to, being able to draw simple two-dimensional shapes in Illustrator to being able to render out sort of like a full-scale blueprint? Well, it's probably helpful to consult this handout that sort of lays out a couple of quick mapped pieces here. Let's start with something that you either know really well or just base your ideas on one of these shapes here. Let's start with some of the kind of most basic, the tetrahedron, the hexahedron, and the octahedron. This guy, right, the octahedron is essentially one of those equilateral triangles repeated 4 times for a top. Flip it over and do the exact same thing on the bottom, so you have an 8-sided equilateral triangle. It seems like we should be able to figure that all out, but if you can't, I've got it sort of mapped out on a handout here for you. You can kind of visualize the solid and then help visualize what we're going to aim at here. I don't want you to just sort of trace over these. I want you to build it out. It'll be much more accurate if you build it out using vectors and copy those shapes. So just kind of consult this handout and then jump into build it. So here's something that will be pretty handy, I think, is try to kind of figure out, try to crack the code of what's the kind of repeating pattern of these shapes. How do they arrange themselves? And I'm going to walk you through this one here to show you the pattern that's sort of embedded in here. So obviously we'll start with a perfect equilateral triangle. I'm going to go to my polygon tool, click once here, grab my 3 sides, and the one that it created is huge. So I'll use keyboard shortcut V and just sort of shrink that down. And as I shrink it, I'm holding the Shift key, because otherwise I may distort that equilateral triangle. I don't want to distort it. I want to kind of create a perfectly even one. So I'll shrink this thing down so that it's a manageable size. And I'm also going to give it a sort of a light gray fill, so that it's a little bit easier for me to see what's going on. As long as I have my fill selected here, I can double click that and change the color fairly easily. This isn't probably the final color, but it's just going to help me kind of see through the design and work through it. Now, if you pay attention carefully to the repeating pattern that lives in this design, you see that there are equilateral triangles that are sort of perfectly butted up against each other. I'm going to kind of use my ability to maybe use my Align palette and use the sort of copy tool by holding Option and dragging these things to sort of make this job a lot easier. So let's start by figuring out how to do one of these end-to-end or sort of point-to-point reflections here. I'm going to grab one of these triangles and just sort of pull it straight up. And as I'm pulling it, I'm holding 2 keyboard shortcuts. One of the keyboard shortcuts is the Option key. That keeps it, that makes a copy of it. You can see the triangle moving up and the double white and black arrows. And I'm also holding Shift, so that no matter how sloppy I am with my trackpad, I can still stay in perfect alignment. Now, if I wasn't in perfect alignment, if I goofed, right, I can select both of those triangles and maybe bring them into horizontal aligned center, so it snaps them into that vertical alignment. And now I'll use either the mouse or even easier, the arrow keys to sort of bump that triangle up. Just using the arrow keys gives it a little nudge. Holding Shift and arrowing gives it sort of big nudges. So at this point, I could hover over the corner using keyboard shortcut V to rotate that equilateral triangle. And as I rotate it, I could hold Shift to make it rotate and snap to perfect kind of 45 and 90 degree rotations. So I can wait till it comes all the way around until I have a perfect corner, and then bump that thing up into position. Once I have these two that are sort of arranged corner to corner, I have one of the basic building block pieces of this design. Now, if I rotated both of these, so I select them both and I rotate them to sort of a horizontal alignment, I'll grab both of these again and make a perfect copy. and hold shift as I drag it over. And this time I want those two to be in perfect alignment, not along a corner, but along an edge. Now, maybe you didn't see that when I copied that over, but because I have my smart guides turned on, I have sort of this hot pink line that shows up as I get really close to that perfect alignment. It shows me where they intersect, and I'll just let go of the mouse there so that now I've got this sort of spine or the wraparound of my two pieces here. Now I'll grab these two center triangles and make a copy of these guys, and as I kind of bring them over, I'll carefully align them until they intersect with these two sort of halves, and I'll make another copy here and pull that straight over. So if you notice, that's basically all of the sides I need. And you know, it didn't take me a whole lot of painful aligning and rotating. I just did it mostly with copies and the align palette. It's really, really handy. Now I'm going to get in really close because I have this feeling that I may have not perfect like alignment here. And keep in mind, we're going to making these out of out of paper and things like that. So our folds aren't going to be perfect. You'll notice that there may even be little weird gaps in the corners, but the more precise you are early in the process, in the design phase, the more precise your models will be. So don't settle for big weird folded gaps and kind of creases in your design. Try to get it fairly precise early. That way the folded paper is much more accurate. Now, one of the reasons, though, that some of these corners may not look like they're in absolute perfect alignment, like these two corners here, is that the strokes may be throwing that off. So I'm just going to turn my strokes off temporarily and take a look at just the pieces. Yeah, I do have a couple of little gaps in there. So what I'll do is maybe use the arrow key, see if I can sort of nudge those over, and looks like they're not quite going to do it. I'll have to kind of move these in with the mouse, just sort of freehand style. But getting these perfect arrangements early, or getting them now, is probably a good idea to try to work out any little glitches that may have sort of popped up along the way. If you have a grid activated or some guides aligned, that can also be a really handy tool to getting these things to align, because once you have a grid or or some guides pulled down, they will automatically snap to those guides. And so having a few of these sort of vertical and horizontal alignment tools already built in will sort of help that alignment process. I'm going to use maybe a vertical and a horizontal guide here to sort of fine-tune some of my alignments. You could do the same thing using grids and build your entire design on the grid, and then make sure that your design snaps to the grid. That could be a really handy way to make all of your alignments work out nicely. Once you get it pretty close, the next step would be designing some flaps for the outside. Now those flaps are going to be important in the process of gluing up our designs. If you remember that this is going to print out flat, and you're not going to really be able to just kind of magically glue edge to edge. Folds hold themselves together pretty well, but you'll need some way to sort of get these two edges to stick together. And so you'll need a little bit of hidden piece of paper stuck underneath that will put a bit of adhesive on, so that when we bring this other edge over, that seam lays nice and flat. Now you can decide how much or how little extra paper you want here. In general, I think it's probably wise not to go all the way to the corners. I think in my next design here, I'll actually make my flaps a little bit bigger to make the glue ups a little easier. And so to make a fold, or to make a flap like these ones here, I would just use the pen tool. It's going to be just sort of waste paper. It's hidden inside of your form anyway. So let's come up to the correct edges here, and you want to make sure that your flaps are actually in the correct edges. So we'll need a flap on this edge and a flap on this edge. I'm just going to use the keyboard shortcut P, pen tool, and I will make a flap that's nearly the full length of the design, and I'll just kind of rough it in quickly here. Now that looks okay, but I think I want to introduce a little bit of a taper so that things really just kind of disappear on the edges. And so instead of fussing over it as a design, I'll draw out something, kind of rough it in at first, and then use my keyboard shortcut A direct select tool to just kind of bring in or bend in the edges of that flap. Now, for me, I find it sort of helpful to differentiate what's a flap and what's the actual face, and so I'm going to turn the fill off of my flaps so that I don't see the difference. I don't mistake the sort of flaps for part of the original design. Now, once I've got one flap designed, I don't need to redraw it in each and every situation. I'll just kind of bring that flap over to the other piece here that I need. And as it prints, I want to make sure that it actually lines up with these edges. So again, be somewhat precise. I still have to fix a couple of weird alignments here. And now I want to make sure that I have a fold flap along each edge of these. I should be able to just make another copy here and stick it up, but I need to do some rotations. So I might start by just hovering over the corner with my selection tool, keyboard shortcut V, and rotate that around. Now that one should line up just fine. Okay, not bad, but these other two are going to be slightly more complicated rotations, and so maybe in this point I might use that keyboard shortcut R rotate tool. I'll put the corner of my design right where I want it. Keyboard shortcut R, click right at that pivot point, and then rotate that design down into position. Remember, those are more or less waste paper pieces. They'll be hidden, so if they're not in absolute perfect position, that's okay. Keyboard shortcut R, and rotate that flap back into position. Now I'm going to check my template once more. So on these templates, I have the octahedron sort of laid out for me here. I've got a fold underneath this leading flap, underneath this leading flap, and then 3 folds around the outside. That essentially is all I need Illustrator to help me do, is to render this design out and get all the folds in the correct places. Now here's a couple of pointers that I recommend. We could just print this thing as is, and then at every folded seam we would notice a really dark line where the stroke was. Now if you would rather kind of make those fold lines sort of disappear, eventually they'll be hiding underneath wooden strips, but for our test piece, if you want to keep them a little bit more subtle, you can work with opacities. If I select the entire design and I turn the opacity down, say I turn the opacity down to 25%, these lines start to get softer and softer, and they won't be quite so obvious on the page. Another thing that you might consider doing is overlaying some sort of texture, color, or pattern to that design so that your final printouts are maybe a little bit more exciting. I ended up using a printout pattern of just some lines that were in perfect alignment. I'll demonstrate how I did that. And on my final template, I just used the plain paper because I thought the wood against the plain paper looked okay. But how would I do something like this? Well, I would recommend maybe not changing the colors directly on your template, but making a copy of your template. So for example, if I wanted to work with an analogous color combination on my octahedron, let's see here, let's go up to the one that I just designed. And I want the top and the bottom to be more or less symmetrical. I'm going to pull a copy of this one up, and instead of being stuck with the kind of boring gray green, I'll double click that fill option here and just assign them all a different color. If I'm selected on all of them, my bright red adjustment will fit to each one of them, and then I could make my adjustments just by either adjusting my hue slider, kind of shifting it into a different spectrum that's still within the kind of orangey yellow spectrum that I was in at first, sort of like this red, orange, maybe shift it into the magenta or purple spectrum, right? And I could even then turn off the strokes so that I don't see those folds. And now that I have a color scheme, place this right on top of my existing patterns and use my colors as a way to enhance my original design, but use my original design as sort of a map for where those might go. If that sounds exciting to you, go nuts. I'm going to stick with a fairly basic pattern. What I did was I used just sort of a vertical line pattern, and I carefully just sort of sliced off each one of those lines inside of my design. It's not a requirement. You're welcome to give it a try if you want, but the way I have these two patterns arranged on the page is because I want to have at least two of them to work with. One of them will be the one that I turn into my final design, but I'm going to keep that set aside for a minute. And I'm going to work on my practice piece, my sort of mock-up. This one is just going to kind of teach you some of the things you need to know and sort of practice some of those folds before I get actually into the final piece. It's not a piece that's going to get a final grade, but it is a sort of like just to give it a try. I want to see this practice piece somewhere around. Once you do the practice piece, you're welcome to get started right away on that wood piece once I provide that tutorial instruction. In order to get them perfectly fitted onto an 8.5 by 11 inch artboard, now I have 3 artboards in this design, but let's just say that one of these was empty. How do we get your designs into that piece of paper that are ready to go? Well, your artboard should already be pre-designed to be the correct aspect ratio, the correct dimensions for the printer paper you're working with. So I'm going to zoom back out here and grab the design that I'm working with. And I recommend, instead of messing up your kind of working copy, or the one that you're actually kind of working on to build it, do a Command C or copy, Command V and paste. And when you do those kind of copy paste, make sure that all of the individual pieces come along with you. If I click and drag over everything and do a Command G or a Control G, that groups it all so that it doesn't fall apart on you. Now I'll rotate this design into position. And as I scale it up to print full page, make sure you're holding Shift. If you don't hold Shift, you'll distort your design and it'll come out looking weird. So hold Shift to expand it to be as big as you can make it. Now I'm going to fit a second one on this same page, and I don't know if I can get them sort of rotated this orientation, so I'll take my second piece here and maybe rotate it a little bit, grab them both, and scale them down until they both fit on the page to be the largest pieces possible. Now, I recommend going as big as you can on your 8.5 by 11 inch page. The amount of wood I provided for you is about enough to do one octahedron if it's printed out to be full scale. If you are nervous that you're going to break too many pieces of your wood, I recommend measuring out how much wood you have. Check the kind of overall dimensions. Make sure you can make enough cuts. You're going to need a strip of wood for every single edge of your equilateral triangle. So count up the number of equilateral triangles that you're going to make, multiply that by the number of sides in an equilateral triangle, and that'll give you a sense of how much wood you have and how much wood you'll need for your design. If you want to play it safe, just design what I designed here, and I've provided enough wood for you for that. Make them fit on an 8.5 by 11 inch piece of paper, and go ahead and send that to the printer, and you'll be working to scale. The next tutorial will pick up with the wood and the gluing part of the project.